Greetings. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I'm Carlton Monroe, Artistic Director of the Bach Ensemble of St. Thomas, and glad to have you here. Our room is filling up as we speak, which is wonderful to see. I'm going to give everybody just a few seconds to make sure we've got our full crowd before we dive in, but I'm glad to have you here. And I'm joining you from my basement, and our guest, Erik Anderson, is joining from his living room in Minot, North Dakota. And all right, well, I guess we will get started. So this is a momentous evening or afternoon because this is the first event of any kind, whether it were virtual or live, that the Bach Ensemble of St. Thomas has done since February 9th, 2020. It's been over a year since when we've been able to offer any kind of presentation or event to our patrons. And it's been a long time, but I'm very glad to be back and have you joining us for this virtual recital. So we do have, this is the first of several events that we'll be offering this spring. In fact, 2 weeks from today, we will present our first virtual Vespers, a performance of Cantata 55. That will be streamed on YouTube. So be on the lookout for information about that. It'll be 2 weeks from today, Sunday at 5 p.m. And we hope you can join us and watch that. It will be available after the fact too, so you'll be able to check it out whenever. Later this spring also, we'll be hosting the debut of Cincinnati's newest early music ensemble, the Seven Hills Baroque, a group of musicians dedicated to playing Baroque music on period instruments. Many of the performers you'll recognize as having been performed with the Bach Ensemble in the past, and we're excited to present them to our community, our online community. And then a few weeks after that, St. Thomas organist Jason Gunnell is going to be presenting a special introduction to the Fritz organ, the new organ being built by Paul Fritz that will be installed at St. Thomas just in 2022, so just over a year from now. So there are a lot of exciting things that we hope you'll join us for. For information, please check our website. Look for emails from me. If you're not on our email list and would like to be, you can visit bachensemble.org and sign up for that. A couple of house cleaning things today. If you're familiar with Zoom meetings and Zoom calls, you may recognize Zoom's platform, but this is a webinar format. So you should be able to see us, but we can't see you. And that's just the way we like it. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But I didn't want you to worry that your video wasn't working. That's the way this format works. We do hope audio and video is real clear. Erik and I have spent some time over the past week making sure we had quality microphones to make sure everything sounds crystal clear for you. There are ways to interact with us, and we hope you'll do that. There is a chat feature, which if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to see chat. And if you use that, you can say hello. In fact, I encourage you to get on there right now and just give us a hello and let us know you're out there and everything seems to be working well. There we go. They start to come in. That's fantastic. And so you feel free to use that. You can chat with others, other attendees who are watching. And that's also a fantastic way to offer some bravos to Erik when he finishes playing. That can be your virtual applause. So please fill that chat up with bravos as long as Erik has earned it. And finally, another thing, there's a Q&A feature on our webinar, and that's going to be the way you can submit questions to me or to Erik. If you find that on the bottom of your screen too, as we go along, if you have a question, please submit it that way, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can, because that's part of what we want to do, is to be able to interact with you. finally, just a general thank you to everyone who supports the Bach Ensemble. It was a challenging year for everyone. I am glad that we are back and able to offer music to you in some format, and we will look forward to the day where we can be playing for you in person again. So thank you for that support, and we appreciate all of it. So with that out of the way, let me welcome our guest, regular patrons of the Bach Ensemble. Erik will not be a stranger to them. Erik is professor of music at Minot State University in North Dakota. And he's been a frequent guest of the Bach Ensemble for the last 3 or 4 years, I think, something like that. And it's been great to have him. And one of the highlights has been when Erik has come down and given these wonderful interactive recitals. And so when I approached Erik, he was happy to try to do this again in a remote fashion. So Erik, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlton. And it's great to see some of the names that are familiar from being at St. Thomas. Those are some of my favorite concerts of the past few seasons.
That's great. Well, and thank you for all the chats. It's great to see everyone saying hello. That's really, really great. So before we dive into some of the music, I wanted to start and kind of introduce our topic for this evening. Erik and I have talked a little bit about this. And to start, I actually want to share with you a video clip. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. And I'm going to... I know video doesn't always work beautifully in Zoom calls, but I think you'll get the idea. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson. It's a movie set in the Revolutionary War times, and Gibson is a farmer and artisan and sort of reluctant warrior. And this is one of the opening scenes of the movie. Let's see if I can get to it here. Excuse me. So he's in his barn and he's testing out a chair that he has just finished crafting. And here's the scene. Let's see if you can see it. And there we go. And he ends up on the floor. Now, audio commentary from Erik. So he's built this chair. He's testing it out. It obviously collapses under his weight. And the next scene that you don't see is he picks up the remnants and he throws them angrily into the corner. And when they land, you see the remnants of a dozen other failed attempts all on the floor. And I thought this was a really interesting idea to start with, because what we're going to be talking about today is the nature of art and the nature of craft. What are these things? What is art? What is craft? Are they the same thing? And how do they play together? Or how does an understanding of those ideas help us understand the role that art has for us? And I think that's going to be what we're trying to explore, especially through music and especially through the music of Bach. In addition, we're going to talk a little bit about creativity. What is creativity? Where does it come from? What kind of circumstances foster creativity? Lots of really interesting concepts, but enough of me talking. Now I'd like to have Erik take it away.
All right, thanks.
Bravo.
Thank you. Spot of tea. All right, gosh,
Erik, I'll let you know, a couple of people
much fun.
mentioned when you talk, if you could pull the microphone a little closer.
Yep.
Thank you. That'd be great.
I think I'll do that.
So again, let me know if this volume is too much, too little. So wonderful to play for you again. Carlton, could you go back to the slides?
Yep.
So art and craft, and certainly one could say that craftsmanship without art is functional, but maybe not so beautiful. Thinking about the Patriot and a chair, you can certainly make a chair that is absolutely functional as a chair, but maybe not so comfortable. Maybe it doesn't inspire anything in terms of like the joinery or the beautiful carvings on the outside. And as the Mel Gibson shows, you can have something that is artistically inspired but not very functional. So art and craft in one very sort of an X and Y coordinate system. One could be the sort of the beauty and the artistry in it, and the other could be just the functionality of the craft of making whatever you're making. In Bach's day, of course, music was a trade. It was something that you learned probably from your father, he learned from his father, and it was just passed down for generations. In fact, there were more than 100 years of Bachs that were musicians. That's just what they did. It was a trade. It was more like a craft, and you learned it. And Bach happened to be fortunate enough to study with maybe the second best artistic Bach, the person who manifested both craft and art, and that was his uncle Christoph. And he went and lived with him. I don't think Bach would have chosen that, but he was orphaned and went to live with his uncle Christoph. And I think we get a picture of how important this person was in Bach's life from the obituary written by CPE, where all of the other Bachs get brief mentions, but Uncle Christoph gets a whole paragraph talking about how important he was. So I think from there we get an inspiration of maybe something that helped take the tradesman background of J.S. Bach and help help it find its footing to move even further. But in J.S. Bach, certainly for the reputation of his pieces and how they stand on their own, 300 years later, he was definitely sort of a beautiful intersection of art and craft. So what I wanted to do today, I want to do less talking and more sort of demonstrating. I don't want to do like the theory deconstruction of stuff, but it's a little bit necessary just to show what we mean by art and craft. So those were berets, and a beret was a typical courtly dance that Bach would have known. And I like to think about, let's say Carlton was assigned to write a YMCA. Right now, you all know what the YMCA is. You have a tempo in mind. You have a character, a feeling. Okay, yes, a YMCA, if it were a whole genre of dances, would have certain characteristics. And this is what Bach was going with. So the craftsman Bach had to account for all of the things that would be in a beret. And typically in those days, you would write two berets. In his instrumental suites, it was a genre that often would come in pairs, and the pairs are supposed to be contrasting. So that was a bit of craft. Also, one of the things that he had to do was he had to start in a key, he had to end in the key, but he had to make it interesting along the way. So think about it as you start at home, you're going to end back at home, but you want to have some adventures along the way. And in Baroque music, that means you make stops at other people's houses that represent other keys. Typically in a Bach suite like this, you might stop in 2 or 3 other keys before coming home. So those are like the craftsman points. It has to be a beret. It has to have those characteristics and sort of that joyous feel of a beret. It needs to start in a key. It needs to end in that key. It needs to obey the metric hierarchy of a beret. So the question is, how could, if there are literally thousands of berets out there, then we get to art. How does Bach make it artistic? How does he make it fun? And I think one of the first things that I would show, if you could go to the next slide, is the relative length of these two berets. Now, there are 6 suites. And if you look at the pairs of dances, all of the 6 suites have the same movement format. They all have 6 movements. They all start with a prelude, then they all have 5 consecutive dances. And the 5th of those movements is always a pair of dances. And in all of them, virtually all of them, they are 24 bars for the first one, 24 bars for the second one. The largest they get is maybe about 30. The other smallest is about 22, but it's always very balanced, except for this one. So this shows you that Bach had license and he was writing these 2 berets. So what does he do? He writes the longest of the first dances of any of them, 48 bars, like twice as long as any of the other dances. So responding to that, he writes the shortest second beret. And that's kind of artistic license. It's the ability to rethink and to adapt how you're doing. So he's having fun with, and it just probably naturally gravitates to a 48 bar beret 1. So the second one is only 12 bars. In fact, I repeated both halves just because it is so formally imbalanced. So I think that's a really fun aspect of this one. So you can see that the first beret is in green and the second beret is in blue. And that is an outlier in the suites, because in the other 5, they're almost identical number of bars. In this one, they are 48 and 12. So 4 times as much. Go to the next slide. So if you look at the first few phrases, one of the things I wanted to share is how Bach has fun with this. So he's got a couple of ideas. One of the things you can see all throughout is there are these slurred groups of darker notes, or 16th notes, that arrive on a quarter note. So that fun pickup beat. And then it's responded to with groups of eighth notes and quarter notes. Okay, so in the yellow highlight, and I highlighted above it, let's take a look at the first 4 bars, the next 4 bars, and the next 4 bars, and we'll see how Bach is having fun and being artistic within this beret. They're all 4 bars, but I want to call your attention to the rhythmic construction of them, which is really fun. So in the yellow one, he has 2 symmetrical phrases, which means he states something on starting on one pitch, and then he states the exact same thing on another pitch. First 4 bars, okay? So already he's going to start to riff on this idea. So instead of 1 pickup in a row, now he has 2 pickups in a row. So 2 sets of 16th notes in a row, and then eighth notes. Now he has 4 sets of 16th notes in a row. And naturally, since the first 2 bars were all 16th note pickups, the last 2 bars are going to be eighths. So that's a way where he has, it all sounds very similar because it's the same language, but yet if you look closely, even in this first 12 bars, he's taking the rhythmic figures of the piece and completely switching them around, so that nothing stays the same. And he's going to continue to do that in the B section. Okay, let's go to the next one. Obviously, we could show all kinds of ways that he's creative. Here's another way. And again, it's the idea of creativity is taking the same thing but doing it differently. Something that's ostensibly the same thing but doing it differently. So here I wanted to show 3 cadences that are basically the same idea. So the first one, again, the blue line is above the music. Okay, so we've got those 4 sets of 16th notes and then eighth notes that wrap it up in B flat major. And we're home. So look at the yellow line, and this is exactly the same thing, but instead of the 16th notes going up, now the 16th notes go down, and then he has the exact same eighth note pattern, but in C minor. Okay, so instead of going up, it's going down. So same cadential pattern, but this is just him doing the same thing differently to keep it interesting. The last cadence, the plum one, is the first 2, the yellow and the blue, bars of virtually. So last 2 is gonna keep the first, and he's gonna change it to final cadence. So if we go back to the blue one, it was. Okay, so if we go to the plum one, it just starts down a 5th. Okay, so exactly the same cadential structure 3 times, but each time he finds a way to play with the material and keep it recognizably the same, but always different. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that Bach does, is he takes such a restricted amount of material and yet finds the absolute most creativity that you can do with it. Okay, move on to the next one. So I wanted to highlight this because I think this is really fun. He's had basically the same rhythmic patterns of pickup 16ths and 8ths going the whole piece. So since this is a really long one, we said this is actually almost twice as long as many of the other dance movements. The yellow box represents a brand new rhythm that he interjects right at the end. It's not played anywhere else in this particular movement, and I think that it adds a little bit of freshness and fun. It always makes me smile every time I play this. So he gets into it with a very similar treatment. That's the blue line. So let me play this, and you'll recognize the blue line. It's the same type of material, but then he gets to the yellow box, and he introduces a brand new rhythm before wrapping up this suite. So even in 48 bars, Bach shows kind of an amazing amount of creativity and playfulness with the material. Now, you don't need to know any of this to enjoy the music, and that's what I think is about Bach's music, is I think it is intuitively playful. It's often compact and brief where it needs to be. It's always creative, and I don't think there's anything inauthentic in any of the notes that he writes. Last excerpt from this particular set of bourrées. Next slide. So I mentioned the bourrée 2. Obviously, it needs to be a contrast. So if you look at the first bourrée, one of the things that you'll notice is there isn't a double stop, meaning more than one note sounding at the same time, until the very end. There's only one note at a time. So craftsmanship here is knowing the instrument you're writing for. Because if you're going to make the instrument play two notes at the same time, you have to know that they work. So here's the brilliant thing that Bach did here. And I love this. And I won't repeat it to show you just how short this this bourrée is. So here's the top line. So if you just look at kind of the stems, well, I guess they're all stems up, but look at the top of the staff and you get this. So it's a melody. He wrote a melody, but here's how good he knew the cello and string instruments, is that he was actually able to write this same bass line. Okay, so he wrote a beautiful melody, simple. He wrote a beautiful bass line, but he knew the cello well enough that you can do this. Which is really amazing. I mean, to be able to play two lines at once. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the artistic beauty of Bach's choices, but also just the craftsmanship of knowing what he's doing well enough to make it work and make it functional. Back to you, Carlton.
All right, that was fantastic. I was trying to monitor, make sure everybody was doing okay. Looks like we're doing well. No questions yet. If you have a question about that piece, please submit it. So I'm going to give Erik a break and just add my 2 cents here. I think one of the things I'm really interested in is the psychology of the art and craft that Erik was alluding to in that piece, and how what they mean for how we train new artists, new composers, new craftsmen of any type. And one of the things that makes me think of is a book that I read years ago. That's one of my favorite books. It's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. And it's a great book. And the opening to the book is the narrator is on a cross-country motorcycle journey with a friend, and they're on cycles riding across the country. And he describes his friend as someone who loves the aesthetics of riding a motorcycle. He loves the wind in his hair. He loves the freedom, being outside, seeing the landscape go by, that he responds to this in a very strong way. But then they stop and something's wrong with his friend's motorcycle. Something with the engine is broken, is not working properly, and they can't drive. And he said he noticed this personality change in his friend, because suddenly he could no longer have that aesthetic feeling of riding a motorcycle, and he was sort of a servant to this engine, and he didn't really know how to fix it. He wasn't completely sure how to repair the engine, and so he was relying on someone else to come out and fix it, and it soured his mood. And the narrators took this story as an example of he proposed two ways that people understand the world. And he used the terms romantic and classic or classicist way of understanding the world. And that is that the romantic understands the sort of aesthetic level of experience, whereas the classicist is more interested in the inner workings of things, the function of things. Now, the truth is that none of us are either one or the other, that we all are kind of a combination of those things. But I think it's really interesting when we think about music, because music has a certain mysticism about it, especially to people who don't feel they have musical training. Erik just did a wonderful job of sort of taking apart this piece and sort of looking at the nuts and bolts. But he also pointed out that ultimately that doesn't matter nearly as much as listening to the piece and having a kind of some kind of emotional reaction to the piece as a whole. But when we talk about training new craftspeople, new artists, we have to recognize that both of those qualities are necessary. Bach's music, that second bourrée, was beautiful because Bach understood the cello. And it's funny how technology has developed to the point where it takes some of that knowledge away from some people. We now have music composition programs that will tell you exactly what a cello can and can't do, right? You can write music and say, I want this to be a cello, and the computer will say, no, that note, you can't play that on a cello. Whereas the craft of being a composer is having that knowledge in you. I think that's one interesting commentary on the way we understand this today. I want to talk a little bit about creativity too before we go back to Erik, because I think it was really fascinating to hear Erik describe the creativity in that piece. I think modern sensibilities equate creativity with maximum freedom, meaning when you are free from constraints, you are free to be maximally creative. And I think this plays into the idea that the arts and that creativity, again, has this kind of mystical, magical quality, and that the constraints of the real world are what stand in the way. And think finger painting, for example, right? Blank piece of paper, finger paints, and you just paint whatever you want there. And that is you being creative. Well, there's another view of where creativity comes from, and it's actually a view in the story of Bach himself. Just as Erik alluded to, his time spent with his brother was most likely one of the most formative experiences of his life. And probably what Bach did was what most young musicians did, which was copy music by hand, writing out scores, whether it was writing out parts for a performance or whether it was copying music to study. This was a pretty common apprenticeship activity for years and years. And it was a way of learning the traditions and idioms and that it's possible that creativity is more a byproduct of the kind of mastery that you gain from practice, from long periods of practice, that it is not necessarily a straight line from inspiration to expression, but the inspiration is filtered through the craft. It's the knowledge that Erik was referring to. I have two quotes I want to share with you, and then we're going to turn it back to Erik. So I'm going to share my screen again. I have lost. Oh, there I am. Sorry, excuse me. That I think these two quotes are interesting to me. The first is from Igor Stravinsky. And he said, "My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit." Then the second quote I want to share with you, believe it or not, I heard literally just 2 days ago. It was one of those crazy moments where I was listening to a podcast and a guest said something that was so appropriate for this discussion. The person was Dana Gioia. I'm not totally sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He's a poet, and he was talking about an influential teacher that he had. And he said this, he said, he understood the intellectual, conceptual, linguistic things of these poems deeply, but they'd been entirely translated into something that had been integrated into his personality and into his imagination as great vehicles of human meaning. He was asking me, almost like an empirical scientist, to study them so well that the structures themselves became internalized in me, not as things that I looked at from the outside, but as ways that I could generate meanings. And that's what poets do. Because you assimilate the tradition, and out of that assimilation, you produce the ability to speak within that tradition, to expand the tradition, and to communicate it. And I was thinking this afternoon about this quote, and I thought of the very common phrase, you need to think outside the box, right? And we know that if you are thinking outside the box, it means you're demonstrating creativity. Well, the one thing we miss sometimes is for you to think outside of the box, you have to start with a box. All right, Erik, back to you.
All right, thanks. Lots of good things to think of. And on that subject of poetry, around the lunch table today, we were just sharing stories we'd heard in the past week, and words, and they were discussing a recently passed nature writer, maybe Barry somebody. I can't remember. You know, that's the thing about being in the car. By the time you get where you're going, you can't remember what you were supposed to write down. But he had written to a young person with 3 points of advice on how to become a poet. And I think these are brilliant, and they tie into what you just said. One was read a lot. 2, figure out what you believe and then write from within that place. Don't try to be someone you're not, and be authentic, but make sure you understand what you believe in first, or you won't have an authentic voice. And the third one was embrace every opportunity to escape the familiar. That is, constantly look for new ways of seeing the world and new expressions and new cultures and travel. And not that where you are and who you are isn't a good thing. It's that the best way to be able to fully understand and explain to everyone your experience and the value of your own experience is to have seen other experiences. I thought those were really beautiful thoughts.
You know what I think is interesting about that is, well, I think while you were saying this advice, I thought of a advice that I read once from Wynton Marsalis, the jazz trumpet player, and he created this 11 rules for, I think it's how to practice, I think is what he called it, or something like that. And it's all very obvious instructions. Like my favorite one is practice the difficult spots longer, right? But I think, but I think what sometimes gets lost because of this idea of this magical mysticism that surrounds being a musician and an artist, is what gets lost is the fact that there are 12 broken chairs in the corner, right? That the sublime experience of performance, of a beautiful performance, is not the result of just pure talent that just shows itself, but it's the talent that is combined with the dedication to throw away the 12 broken chairs because you've had to work through all of that at the same time.
And no matter how beautiful a chair you make today, the one you make tomorrow, you want to be an improvement.
That's right.
Or
all right, take it away.
Expression. All right, let's go back to the slides.
I'm going to interrupt here. We're having
yes.
We're having a little connectivity trouble. At least I am. So I was going to have you start that over again because we lost you. At least I think we lost you a little bit.
Okay.
All right.
All right, take two. Okay, those are the first 4 bars of the prelude to the second suite in D minor. And so a little bit about the craft. I should say too, I also like variations. So the first time I played the bérets and then we talked about them. This time I'm going to talk a little bit about the prelude and then I'll give you a complete performance of it. And then the third piece I play today, I'm pretty much just going to play for you. So a prelude, unlike a dance, is an improvisation. It could really be anything. There's a wonderful quote from Glenn Gould, the famous Canadian pianist who from kind of like the mid 20th century. And one of the things that he said about performing is that he never really knows how he's going to play a piece until he hears the result of him hitting the first note on the piano, because every piano is different, every night is different, and it could be that he hits it louder than he intended or softer than he intended. But the fundamental idea is that in order to improvise, you must begin with something and then you react to that. So in this case, those first 4 bars are Bach's way of stating the musical material that he's then going to improvise on for a while. So I think some of the things that are structural in this that I want to call your attention to, it's in 3/4. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Okay, and in all of those bars, beat 2 gets the emphasis. 2, 2, 2. Okay, so beat 2 gets what's called an agogic accent, or just an accent of duration. There's a really long note in the space of moving notes, so it tends to get a lot of gravity, and that's similar to a sarabande. So maybe Bach was thinking about a sarabande, maybe not. But anyway, one of the features of this is there's upward moving notes and downward moving notes, upward arpeggios, downward scales. and there's an emphasis on beat too. So you might say, okay, those are some of the things that he's going to riff on over the course of this improvisation. Another thing is that we have a lot of what's called diminished harmonies, and diminished harmonies, like maybe when Carlton is back at the piano, he can play. If you can think of Snively Whiplash, when he ties someone to the railroad tracks, it's always a diminished seventh harmony. That, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? But it's a very unstable harmony. Okay, so I'd say those are three features that you'll want to pay attention to. He's going to riff on. So he had to come up with a structure, and I think this is an example of craftsmanship, because you could do this with anything, and it could be a really, really terrible piece of music. So the fact that he organizes the piece this way isn't necessarily admirable, but I think it's interesting. So if you take a look at the colors on the screen, the blue bracket is the first phrase, and a phrase is defined as a complete thought or a sentence in music. So if I ended at the end of one of those brackets, there's a plausible way to just end. Now, like I said, is in the first one, he starts in a key, ends in a key, and goes to many other keys. Each one of these phrase endings ends up in a different key. So the story really wouldn't be complete, but that's kind of how it works. But this is how Bach organizes this particular prelude. The first phrase is 4 bars. The second phrase is 8 bars. The third phrase in green brackets is 12 bars. The fourth phrase actually doesn't really cadence for 30 bars. And it is the meat of the story. It's where the action is building. And so it's not surprising that we have the longest structure in the center. And then the blue at the very end is sort of the coda that wraps it up. So that's fascinating. So he did that. That's a nice structural thing. Go to the next slide. So this is the same thing. And what I wanted to show you is that he not only varies the phrase length, but the range of the piece. That is how small the intervals or the range of notes is from the lowest note to the highest note keeps getting bigger in every single phrase, finding its climax near the center and in the plum bracketed phrase. So in the first one, in the blue one, the lowest note is a C sharp, the highest note is an E, which is a range of a tenth. In the next phrase, twice as long, the lowest note is a G, and the highest note is a D. So it went from a tenth to a 12th in range, and the low note went down. In the third phrase, which is 12 bars long, the lowest note is D, and the highest note is F. So now a 17th, more than a double octave. So this is not only longer, but the range is getting both lower and higher. And then in the plum colored phrase, we have the lowest note of the entire piece, C sharp, only 4 bars away from the highest note in the entire piece, G. And those are all circled so you can see them. So in other words, not only is he making each sentence a little bit longer, or each chapter in the story a little bit longer, but he's expanding the experience of that. These are what I would call craft. Those are things that don't necessarily lend any artistic merit. They're very interesting, and I find them fascinating as a performer to know. But you could certainly do those things and you'd have a chair of no artistic merit, but one that is functionally strong. Next slide. Okay, and then I want to show you, there's 2 more things. The first is, again, like the berets, how he plays around with material. So blue lines and yellow lines represent different types of moves that he's going to make. So in the first 3 bars, you have basically the same idea, an upward arpeggio to 2, and then down on 3, and then again. So Okay, so it's like 1-bar units that mimic each other. Again, there's so much more I could get into, but I want to keep it brief. So let's go to the third phrase. And so you can see it, it's marked now in alternating blue bars, very much like the opening of the piece, and yellow bars, which are fundamentally different. They have a single note and then a 3-note slur. And a slur is when you take 3 notes all in the same bow direction, so there's no variation. So listen to this, and you can see that it's blue, yellow, and then a transition bar. So the first bar is. That's the second type of bar, noticeably different. Then we have another rising bar to beat 2. Then the yellow style bar. Then a transition. Now, here's Bach again playing with the material, just like he did in the berets. Now we're going to have 3 in a row of the blue bars, and then to balance that, 3 in the row of the yellow bars. So again, he likes to he likes to balance material, but do so creatively. So the blue bars. So 3 statements, very much like the opening 3 bars. And then we have that yellow style bar. So that's another element you can see where he's taking an economy of material, but playing with it. How many different ways can I enjoy this same idea? Making subtle changes, but ones that are really fun. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so here the blue lines represent beat 2. So I wanted to show you that at the opening, 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and you can see that we're going upwards. Now, if you look at the climax of the piece, the most intense moment, it's where the green line starts on the second page, and we're at the very highest note. What I want you to notice is that on beat 2 is the most important pitch to signal we're going home. If you speak theory, it's called the dominant. It's an A in D minor, but that's where that blue line is. Okay, so he flips the idea upside down. Instead of an arpeggio up to beat 2, now it's an arpeggio down to beat 2. I think in part because he's drawing our attention to the heights that he's taken this entire story to climb, to that high G. Incidentally, those 2 notes outline a dominant chord. That's theory speak, so you don't need to know that. But for those of you that do speak theory, you might find that fascinating. Okay, and last thing. Next slide. So at the very end, when he finally resolves that 30-bar phrase, here's the first yellow circled note. E, F, G, and then A. Okay, so you can see that this is organized around a scale. Then there's 4 A's, and then we're at the end. Now, the interesting thing is that Bach has decided in this particular case, all of a sudden to just write chords. So these are the chords that he wrote, and this is the boxed yellow part. And cellists, of course, talk ad nauseum. So do violists, bassists play these suites as well. Well, did Bach really mean for us to only play chords there, like I just did? I like fun. I really get so disheartened when people talk about right and wrong. I think there's respectful, and you should be respectful of the score. That's important. But why do we go to concerts? We don't go to concerts to hear something right. We go to hear something interesting, something that challenges us or makes us think. And I would, you know, I don't know. Well, I'm probably the only person in the world that I wouldn't buy a ticket to hear play, because I don't want to hear people play like I do. Um, I already am me, and I know kind of how I think. And so when I go to hear a concert, when I hear someone else, I would like to hear something new, something I've never thought of. And so anyway, fun. So I get to these chords, and something that I thought of, I guess I was probably an undergraduate when I first thought of this idea, but I was like, um, why don't I model each one of these bars after each of the first four suites? And so I played, instead of so, just having fun with that idea. Now that's probably a little on the outer edge of fun. That might be a little outlandish. So what I've arrived at, my favorite version of this, is one where I actually take the rhythm from bar one and just map it onto all of these. So and so I'm trying to play respect to the chord, but also have a little more rhythmic fun, and not having to hold for 3 beats allows me to continue the crescendo or make a shape. So anyway, those are just some things to think about. Here is the prelude to the D minor suite. And Carlton, if you want, you can keep the score up.
Beautiful job. Beautiful. All right. Great job. So everyone, I'd like to, we're reaching 6 o'clock here. We didn't want to go, Erik has another one more piece to play, and we don't want to go too much longer, but we would like to field any questions that you might have. I haven't seen any submitted yet. And if you're just in awe of the beautiful cello playing, that is great too. While I give Erik just a brief break, I wanted to, let me pull, sorry, I'm pulling my screen back up. I just wanted to mention another perspective on craft with Bach that I think is kind of interesting. And I might, Erik, just so you know, I'm going to do this a little quicker than I had originally planned. Erik talked a lot about the craft of writing for the cello and the knowledge of the instrument. And that's, in a sense, when you choose to write a piece for the cello, that's the first box you're drawing, right? Is, okay, I'm going to write a piece for the cello, so I'm not going to be able to write it like I would write for a flute. Well, Bach in his sacred choral music, which of course is the music that I'm most involved with, he had a number of different boxes that he had to fit into. And this was another way of thinking of how music functions. There's one way to say, does it function in a musical manner? Does it have tension and release? Do chords resolve into other chords, or do they not resolve? And how does that play? But there's also a layer of functionality for church music in that he was writing for specific instances and specific conditions. He was employed. He had demands put on him by his employer. He had to write certain music for certain days. And Bach had an ideal that he called a well-regulated church music. And by that, he meant he was endeavoring to compose music that would completely cover the complete liturgical seasons of the church year for multiple years, so that he had repertoire that was usable for every possible liturgical setting that he was responsible for writing music for. It was a huge goal of his. And that was one of the ways that he had to sort of produce functional music. And with that in mind, the things that he was limited to when he started to write a piece were, well, the feast day that he was writing for was dictated. The readings for the day were dictated. So he was working with biblical readings that were already preset. And a lot of times the instruments that he was writing for were also preset. He had to make decisions about who he had available. If he had a musician who was unavailable, he couldn't write for that instrument. So he had to figure out another way to fill out his ensemble. He made decisions like the week after Easter, he tended to write cantatas that were pretty modest in scale because all the musicians were worn out after big cantatas and services on Easter Day. And so you can see the cantatas he wrote in the weeks after big feast days tend to be very small in scale, very few instruments, and not a lot of choral parts, mostly for soloists and things like that. And yet the craft of Bach is to take those conditions and to take those constraints and still find a way to write music that was highly expressive, highly creative, highly beautiful, and meaningful for people. And I think it's just sort of interesting to consider it in that regard. Erik, are you ready with your last piece? Let me see if no question. So you must have just answered everything that people want to know.
I would actually love to hear some of the examples that you were going to play.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll pull them up then.
If you don't mind.
Well, you know what? When I see the attendees drop to 0, maybe that's when we'll stop. How about that? Actually, we do have a couple of questions, so let me read one to you. So Janet has written that Bach's music has been called mathematically perfect, Music 101. Can you comment on that? What do you think about that?
I think it is, mathematical calls to mind all kinds of like ratios and formulas and things like that. I certainly he was a structural genius. And I think that's where that kind of understanding, mathematical, I mean, in my initial reaction is yes, absolutely. If any composer is worthy of that, it would be him. Of course, there were some 20th century composers that really embraced the idea that, oh, math can be music. Well, let's let's run with that.
Didn't
And I'm not
always turn out so well.
didn't always turn out as well. Of course, I don't know that music as well as I know Bach, so it's unfair of me to judge. I will say this: whether or not you believe it is like the Fibonacci series and the golden ratio 0.618 roughly, um, that D minor prelude, the moment where so it starts out, 0.618 in that piece is actually the start of the climax. So I don't think that Bach would be like Bartok, or Tool, to take a modern example, where they chose specific works to structure them after the Fibonacci series. I don't think Bach would be that like, okay, I'm going to take this preordained thing and do it. Now, the golden mean was certainly understood. Bach would have studied Euclidean geometry, so that would have been something that would have been known to him. But I will say that proportion is really, really good at narrowing down the section of music where he turns towards the dominant, or that last house you visit before you turn around and go home. And his music, so I would say there are some mathematical principles that he was aware of, and so it's a fascinating topic. Again, I don't think right or wrong is interesting. I think it's a fascinating question, and exploring the music through a mathematical lens it's wonderful.
Yeah,
It's
I
illuminating.
think, I mean, I think this isn't mathematical, but Bach was clearly interested in numbers and felt that there was significance in numbers. I mean, there are plenty of examples where he would write pieces of a certain length for a particular reason. There's in the, I think it's the St. Matthew Passion, there's a chorus when it's the disciple, Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me, and the disciples all respond, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Is it me? And then there's 11 iterations of is it me? Because of course the 12th one didn't ask. Like Judas didn't have to ask, is it me? Right. So
Right.
Bach was definitely interested in numbers in dramatic senses like that, I think, too.
In 161, Schlagerdag, where he's like imitating a clock. Is
Yeah.
there a
Yeah.
particular number of clock beats there that has any significance?
Good question. I don't know.
Okay. We'll look that up later.
We'll look that one up. All right. We had another question from someone who wanted us to comment on the art on the walls behind both of us. So do you want to tell us about what's behind your piano there?
Sure. Yeah, this is a
Totally different from Bach, right?
Yeah, my wife Diana found this beautiful Marimekko. I think it's on canvas or some sort of fabric, and she bought two of them because we needed something. The wall behind the piano it's scaled so that the piano in the context of our living room doesn't look so big. So it's a 15-foot ceiling behind there, and so we needed about a 12-foot piece of art. And so she bought two of these really beautiful, Kandinsky-esque patterns, and then you can see how they lined up. We put one facing downward and the other facing like this, and so you get this kind of twisted mirror image.
That's cool. So mine,
I built the frame
mine
out of
behind me. I'll move out of the way for a second. This is a Charlie Harper print, who people in Cincinnati might be familiar with Charlie Harper, and it's hard to see, but it is a bear right there walking through a stand of trees. You kind of see that right there. And I have a pretty significant bear theme in my office for reasons I can't tell right now. I can't tell that story. We'd be here for hours if I told the bear story. One more question. Gary is impressed by your memorization of the music and wanted to know how many pieces do you know, like memorized, and do you believe memorization is central to performing?
No, memorization is not central, and many performers find themselves almost paralyzed at the idea. Performers with beautiful things to say find themselves paralyzed in the face of performing from memory. They could walk off stage and play just fine. They're playing from memory, and it just doesn't work. So I think in that case, certainly saying that people have to memorize is, I think, is far too limiting. That said, I think all of us have been to see a theater show. Could you imagine being at a theater where everyone's walking around reading out of books? It would seem so unlifelike and so impersonal. So my belief is that I feel more connected to the audience when I can close my eyes and when I can like live inside the music. And so memory to me is something that is central to my performing, probably because it was asked of me when I was 4 years old. And so I grew up, playing Suzuki things, and everything was memorized, and you always played in front of people from memory. Now, that said, 1 hour before we started today, I'm thinking to myself, will I remember any of these pieces? Will I pick up my bow and just be like, I don't know how it goes. So I don't think that ever goes away. Um, I think I'm good at laughing off problems. Like in the D minor preludes, if for those of you that know it really well or were following along the score, I had to actually repeat 2 bars because I skipped ahead and had to go back. And so thinking on the fly and saying, okay, well, how do I get myself out of this? um, it's a good question. I love to memorize. I have a lot. I think if you count the Suzuki books that I had to play when I was younger, I probably have a lot of pieces still memorized.
You know, I kind of have flip-flopped on this question over the years. The most influential conductor on me was Ken Fulton, who was the director of choral activities at LSU. And he was heavily influenced by Robert Shaw, who's obviously a name most people know of. And one of the things that Robert Shaw did in the 20th century for choirs was he tried to make a true profession out of choral singing. And so his model for a professional choir was a professional orchestra. And of course, with orchestras, especially an orchestra like the Cincinnati Symphony, every week they show up, they've got a new set of repertoire, right? You would never have a symphony memorizing their parts because every week they're playing a new concert. And so Shaw was very much interested in modeling that idea that a professional choir could show up, have music in front of them, sing it, prepare it, and perform it in a short period of time. And so it was never a possibility of memorizing music. And he also he believed very much in marking in the score, and he wanted the marks to mean something, so that when you saw a mark, it was a memory trigger to that moment in the rehearsal, right? And so interacting with the score was sort of a very essential part of a choral singer from that kind of choral model. But in recent years, and so I was very reluctant to have choirs that memorize their music, even though the conditions were different. I was usually preparing choirs that had 25 rehearsals before a performance, and so, but I have come to also believe that there is some value in memorization when it's possible, because I think you internalize the music in a different way, and it becomes a little bit more of an extension of something, of yourself, rather than just reiterating a score, I think. But I go back and forth on that. All right, those were all wonderful questions. So I think what we ought to do, Erik, is I'll have to show my slides on the next um, uh, time we do something like this. I'm happy to do that, but I know you've got another piece that you want to play, and I think it would be great to hear that. So I've had a couple people ask if this is being recorded. Yes, it is. I actually got an email from someone who was having trouble connecting, so we will be able to post this. So people can see it at a later time. So I'll be sure to send out information to everybody about that. So I guess, Erik, do you want to finish this off?
Sure. Do you want to pull up that last slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, then I'll have to skip through mine real quick so people can see what they're missing. Let's see. Yep. Oh my gosh, that was so brilliant what I was going to say there. All right. Let me, I'm going to.
I learn every time I come to Cincinnati. So this is the Sarabande, and I think this is one of the most beautifully artistic uses of the cello out of all the repertoire that's ever been given to us. It's a sarabande, of course. You can see that there are a lot of double stops, that is, two notes sounding at the same time, triple stops, quadruple stops. So you would say that this is a chordal composition. It uses a lot of, harmonies, that is, multiple notes sounding at the same time, as opposed to a single line. And I think I won't say anything more other than this is one of my very favorite pieces that Bach wrote and that anyone wrote for the cello. And I think it is a perfect example of someone who knew the cello well enough or knew strings well enough to be able to write something of this incredible austerity is maybe not the right word, but it is important, it is passionate, it's beautiful, it's heavenly, it's an amazing piece of music. So the Sarabande from the D major suite.
Beautiful, Erik.
Wow, Bach.
Really wonderful. Making sure that we had all of our questions answered. Erik, thank you so much for joining me today. It was just really great doing this and us figuring out how to do this, because I know I'd love to do something like this again really soon. Everyone that joined us, thank you very much for being here. I'm just double checking to see, make sure I haven't. Yep. Oh, we're getting lots of thanks. So it's really great. If you enjoyed this, please let us know. We would like to do something like this again soon. And again, just a reminder to check out on the webpage for our upcoming virtual events, including 2 weeks from today, when we will have our first cantata performance on YouTube. And look forward to seeing you again. All right. I guess that will wrap things up. Thanks a lot, Erik.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carlton, and for everyone that attended today. Bye.
Everyone have a great evening.
Tip of the iceberg, Carlton.
That's right. Bye-bye.